Good afternoon, everyone. I'd like to welcome you to our Breakthroughs in Cancer series, and in particular to today with our guest, Dr. Barbara Bierer from Harvard Medical School. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Beverly Mitchell. I'm the Director Emeritus of the Cancer Institute, and I'm really delighted to see this audience both in person and all of you on Zoom who are attending the seminar. Our Breakthroughs in Cancer series, as you know, features a lot of important advances, both in clinical and translational science. We have a really spectacular group coming up in the following year. Many of you know Ron Levy, who's one of our foremost physician scientists who's contributed so much to lymphoma, and he'll be talking to us in July. We take a break in August, and then starting again in September, we have some wonderful speakers coming through. So I hope everybody will be here to join us for those talks. And we also have two events coming up that I want to make sure you know about. We have our Comprehensive Cancer Research Training Program, which has been going on for something like 15 years now, which is a wonderful event to try and improve the teaching of our trainees, ranging from high school all the way through fellowship. And it really is a wonderful event. And then we also have the Stanford Cancer Institute Advances in Mass Spectrometry, which is part of our drug discovery program that's going to take place in October. And so today we are really honored to have our speaker, Barbara Bierer. She is here to talk to us about institutional actions to promote representativeness in clinical trials, which is really one of our most important missions of the Cancer Institute. And here to introduce Barbara is my co-host, Dr. Lydia Shapira, who is the director of the Stanford Survivorship Program. Lydia.
Thank you. Good afternoon. It is my great honor to introduce my friend and colleague, Dr. Barbara Bierer, and welcome her to Stanford. I must tell you, I first met Barbara when I was a resident assigned to the rotation where Barbara was a fellow, and she taught me how to write an oncology consult note, something that I have tried to pass on. Dr. Bierer received her undergraduate degree from Yale, her medical degree from Harvard Medical School. She trained at the Mass General Hospital and then was on the faculty at the Brigham and Women's Hospital for a very long time. She's an accomplished researcher in immunology and hematology. Dr. Bierer is a professor of medicine at Harvard Medical School and serves as faculty director of the Multi-Regional Clinical Trial Center of Brigham and Women's Hospital and the Harvard MRCT Center. I want to tell you a little bit about her multiple accomplishments, which make her current vision so extraordinary. Dr. Bierer spent a few years at NIH, returned to Boston in the early aughts, I think, and has held multiple leadership positions at the Brigham and Women's Hospital and Harvard Medical School. She serves as director of the Regulatory Foundation's Ethics and Law program of the Harvard Clinical and Translational Science Center and the director of Regulatory Policy, SMART IRB. She's a faculty in the Center for Bioethics at Harvard Medical School, an affiliate faculty in the Petrie Flom Center for Health Law Policy, Biotechnology, and Bioethics at Harvard Law. Previously, she served as Senior Vice President of Research at the Brigham and Women's for 11 years and was the institutional official for human and animal research, for biosafety, and for research integrity. She initiated the Brigham Research Institute and the Innovation Hub, a focus for entrepreneurship and innovation, and was the founding director of the Center for Faculty Development and Diversity at the Brigham and Women's Hospital. In addition to her academic responsibilities, Dr. Bierer served as chair of the Secretary's Advisory Committee for Human Research Protections in the Department of Health and Human Services from 2008 to 2012, as a member of the National Academy of Sciences Committee on Science, Technology, and the Law from 2007 to 2016, on the boards of directors of Primer, Public Responsibility in Medicine and Research from 2011 to 2020, Management Sciences for Health from 2013 to 2022, and is currently on Vivli, CliniThink, and the North Star Review Board. She chairs the Board of Trustees of the Edward P. Evans Foundation, a foundation supporting biomedical research, and has authored or co-authored over 260 publications. We are thrilled that she accepted our invitation to share with us today her experience and vision for increasing access of minoritized populations to cancer clinical trials.
Thank you. Thank you, Lydia. Thank you, Bev. And thank you for inviting me here and having me. It's just been a wonderful, wonderful day. I was thinking about what I was going to talk about today, and I decided to talk about something I haven't really talked about before. Not the fact that clinical trials need to be more representative, but rather, what can the institution do to help investigators and others, propel representativeness in clinical trials? So thank you again for having me. These are my own views. The center is supported by voluntary contributions and grants, but I have no personal conflicts of interest. So here are the learning objectives. I had to write them so you could get CME credits. I hate them. So we're just moving right along. So the MRCT Center is a research and policy center at the Brigham and Women's Hospital and Harvard that really focuses on addressing the conduct, ethics, and oversight regulatory environment of international multi-site clinical trials. And we do that with by convening groups, whoever is involved in the problem or could have an opinion about the solution. What we've done is collaborate, convene those people to address the problem, and then think about a way forward, a practical, actionable way forward, thinking that if everybody collaborates to find the solution, it's more likely to take hold. So we have pharma companies, academics, patient advocates, IRB folks, regulators, whoever is involved in some things, journal editors, and it's all usually international. Whatever we do in the US has to have, as we choose our projects, has to have resonance internationally. And when we do things internationally, obviously it has impact in the US. So today I'm going to talk about diversity and inclusion in clinical research. This is not a new concept to anybody here. In fact, most of us are sort of tired of hearing the same thing over and over, and the talk, not the walk, not the do. So you're going to have one more of those today, because I am going to talk about it. But I'm only going to give like 2 seconds of background to make sure that we're on one page, which is to say that participant enrollment is always a challenge in clinical trials, but it is clearly a greater challenge in underserved and underrepresented populations. The research that we do should be representative of those that have the condition or the disease by demographic and non-demographic factors. In fact, that rarely happens, or for whom the intervention is intended independent of insurance. You can do an analysis of group differences, and you may reveal some differences in those groups if you compare men versus women or old versus young. But race and ethnicity are obviously not biologic, they're social constructs. They can be an indicator, but it's never a direct indicator, at least on the basis of race or ethnicity. It may be by other factors. And it's nevertheless a surrogate for those factors. But by analyzing it, you may be able to see group differences or indications of group differences. But if you really think about the intersectionality of people, these trials would need to be huge to have any statistically significant differences. So we're not looking for that, really. We're looking for signals. We're looking for a fairness in the distribution of direct and long-term benefits of the results, and it's a matter of health equity and fairness. And of course, the decision as to how representative these trials should be changes with the more that you know about a drug, biologic, or device. as you have greater safety data, you're going to be more comfortable, including people with renal disease or who are old and frail, for instance. That is not true when you're doing a phase 1, perhaps. So we got interested in this in 2016 as a purposeful endeavor when we saw the drug trial snapshots, which is an FDA publication that now comes out every year, which takes the demographics of the trials that informed the approval of a new medical entity, new medicinal entity, approved that year, and then aggregates them to see the distribution. So it's not every trial, it's those that are newly approved in the United States. And what you can see, because these are global clinical trials, is that the total populations are obviously different. In aggregate group of 5 years, globally it was about 11%. In the US, Black and African American patients were 16%, Asian were 2%, and the rest of the world 16%. Black and African American globally was 16% in the US, and the rest of the world less. That's of course and then some other pieces, but the overwhelming majority of the populations examined were white. But this changed dramatically if you looked at the representativeness across therapeutic areas. And you'll note that in cardiovascular diseases, in oncology and hematology, the numbers of Black and African American men were very, very small and not representative of the population. So we started looking at that and actually did a study where we looked at the drug trial snapshots over 6 years from 2015 to 2021. That might be 7, but who's counting? 339 drugs, and reanalyzed the data. Of all the reports, 21% of the trials included less than 1% Asian patients, and 25% included less than 1% of Black or African American participants. If you looked at the average population weighted by enrollment, that's in blue, which is what was reported by the FDA. But if you look at the median, that's in orange. That's what we calculated. So it was a huge problem. And if you look at this by drug class, for instance, and you look at multiple myeloma as a good example, Black patients die at greater than 2 times the rate of white patients. But if you look at the representativeness in clinical trials, you'll see that whites overwhelmingly majority population in those trials. So how can you determine from this kind of data what the impact would be on Black patients? And I'll say that at least in this time, the representativeness did not get better over time. Even as people were starting to talk about it and think about it, the distribution of annual trial population was unchanged over the 6 years. True for all drugs, true for oncology drugs. And if you look at, for instance, prostate cancer, you know the same story. Prostate cancer rates are the highest in African Americans. African Americans are twice as likely to die from prostate cancer. And if you look at one of the drugs that was approved, for instance, in this case, 3% were Black or African American. Now, what does that mean? That means the following. In the labeling of this drug, it says sex, all patients were men since it was a treatment for prostate cancer, race, the occurrence of side effects was similar among white and Asian patients. The number of other patients in other races was limited. Therefore, the occurrence of side effects among other races could not be determined. You will see that in the vast majority of approvals. And the side effects by age were similar. At this point, they didn't even examine Hispanic, Latin American, and we had to tell them that this was something that they should do routinely. Starting in 2017, they did. However, if you look at the advertisement for this drug, who's center stage? Trying to make the point that it is equally or at least effective in this population just by representing a Black man for this drug, even though there was very little data there. So it's pervasive in the way we have sort of structured clinical trials. And we took this in 2016 and started this work, which then became sort of more current in 2020 with COVID and the murder of George Floyd, and people became sensitive to the enormous health disparities in this country and started to work on it. But noted, of course, that it's not just social justice and fairness. There are significant biological differences which do relate to other factors that influence the side effects or efficacy. So if you look at these drugs, they all have differences based on HLA alleles or other sort of differences in cytochrome P450 distribution, et cetera. And we've just finished, by the way, a whole piece of work on trying to change the eligibility for Black patients where there's a normal variant which used to be called chronic, forget what it used to, chronic neutropenia, chronic ethnic neutropenia, or is that right? Chronic ethnic neutropenia. The people, Black people who were Duffy null, which is an antigen on red cells, routinely had a lower white count, ran about 1,500 rather than our general 3,500, 4,000. So they were excluded from clinical trials because of a low white count. They couldn't get chemotherapy when they needed it, and other problems for a normal variant. If you go to Africa, the normal white count in Africa is low because it's mainly an African population. So we've now spent 1.5 years getting this reclassified, work that was done in collaboration with others at the Brigham. So if we really want to change how we think about clinical trials and the representativeness of those trials, patients have to be invited to those trials. That means that you have to consider all the different factors that make up an individual and the intersectionality of them, and really walk through almost everything about a trial in order to come up with those things that one can change and those things where it matters whether and how you approach and design the trial. So first, there are things trial independent, that the participant needs access to and knowledge about the trial, and I would say even before then, about clinical trials themselves. They need to be eligible for the trial, and you'll note that the FDA currently has 3 requests for comments on draft guidance changing the cancer eligibility criteria. Trial accessibility, they have to be able to get to the trial, to pay for the trial, to get the transportation, et cetera, and it has to be accessible. Trial burden and operations. When we think of a trial, we think of a risk-benefit analysis. For certain populations, they think about whether they can afford it. Can they get childcare? Can they do all of these other things, including 17 extra visits to the hospital, in order to participate in that trial. Trial costs and accommodations, and then, very importantly, the end of study and communications. So first, they need access to knowledge and choice, access and accessibility to the trial. You need to consider the resources and referral patterns of the populations, and then the trial has to be designed for the patient. But if you do that, you would say you should increase the participant pool, you should increase enrollment. It may take different effort, it may take more effort, but you should shorten the trials, and therefore there is a business case for this as well. Now, if you think about, what you need to do, and I'm not going to go through chapter and verse about all of this, there's participant and community engagement, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. There's study design and planning, such as the traditional hybrid and decentralized trials, and trials that include decentralized elements to the extent possible. These should be designed for inclusion. They should be accessible, health literate, translated. They should have eligibility criteria that are broad. Recruitment efforts should be well structured. Navigators should be present if you can afford them, and payment should be taken care of. They should be resourced with data and digital access, technology help, fiscal neutrality, and they should be insurance independent. None of this is quite possible to say, I want my wish list, and we're going to talk about what we can do about that. But we also need to be thoughtful about communications and confidentiality, security and connectivity. And finally, at the end of the study, you need to think about, wow, let there be light. Results return, okay, let there be darkness. Transitions of care for the participant and continued engagement of the community. In other words, we don't go to the community just to extract the right number of participants and the right breed and demographic of participants, but rather we engage with the community in an ongoing and significant way. So with all this, the question was, how did we communicate it? In 2020, we published the first, 400-page, thesis on achieving diversity, inclusion, equity in clinical trials. It's available online on our website, but it has within it a whole set of toolkits for increasing diversity, inclusion, and equity, and each of these opens as an accordion into a number of tools. We did a significant series of webinars because even though we published it, people said, well, how do we start? So we did an hour and a half times 6 of sort of breaking down each of these things into a webinar series, followed that up with a series of webinar talks on specific issues about, translation or recruiting people with disability or whatever. We did make that course, and then we did a course with diversity by design, equity by design with the Dana-Farber Cancer Institute and made that available. We got into people with disability and thinking about how supported decision-making should be something that we anticipate and provide for and ask about, so that people who are able to make an autonomous decision can make it with the support of someone who can take the time to communicate. We have done a lot of work in health literacy in clinical research and have tools across each of these elements of health literacy, and now have also done a clinical trial glossary, so that when people say randomization or double-blind, everybody means the same thing, whether it's at the Brigham or Stanford or Sanofi. And then we've done a equity by design metrics, a user case for that, tools for the IRB, tools for the HRPP, a set of tools for inclusion of people with disability, and now just launched today a set of tools for LGBTQI plus inclusion. And finally, a national action plan for diversity. So with that, you'll see that these tools really try to deconstruct the kinds of things that we can do to increase diversity inclusion in our clinical trials by helping sort of jumpstart the design, execution, and considerations. But it also means you need to know the populations that you're trying to recruit and have a sensitivity to language, culture. You know, where do they get their information? Is it through TV or social media? And if social media, which social media? Is it through the church or the school, or is it from their doctor? You know, we don't really think about the linguistic and cultural differences. And in the federally qualified health center where I spent a significant amount of time working at COVID, you know, there are 10 languages and 10 different communities where they get their information differently. And if we didn't spend time there, we would never have known that. So when we talk about community, there's really a way of thinking about it. It's not just who's outside your door, it's who the people define themselves. And then there are other communities like the breast cancer community or others that need to be considered that are also specifically involved. So there are pre-study considerations, on-study, and post-study, and you'll have these slides. So, you know, really there's accountability. And there's accountability for each of the clinical trial stakeholders that engage in the ecosystem of clinical trials. And you can see them here. And I would posit that we all have accountability. And somebody said to me at one point, well, if we all have accountability, then no one's accountable. And I think that's not true. We really all do have accountability, and we also have a responsibility to keep and keep the other stakeholders honest so that we share the data and the frustrations and the challenges, and also help each other be successful. Because if you get to a point where you're fighting with a sponsor about a contract, you got to get on one side of this. It's not like a fight. It's that both of you want the same outcome, and it's a negotiation for how to get there. So I think we've come a very, very long way, and I think that actually pharma is far ahead of most academic institutions, but in some ways they have the easier part. They have the ability to design the study and fund the study and cite the study, but they never do the recruiting of the patients. They never see the patients and the group that comes to the clinic or that you do outreach. So, you know, the second group that has been a focus of major attention has been the investigators and the study staff. And as I've gotten, you know, more familiar, I think that what we miss here is the institutional support that could be provided by the institution for the investigators and their staff to really make this a comprehensive approach to changing how we do trials. And that is something that I wanted to explore with you today in greater detail. So is there a role for institutions? The answer is yes. And I will begin to sort of explore that with you a little bit further. So first I'll say that, you know, institutions often defer to their IRB or to their Human Research Protection Program for review and approval of these trials and say whatever they say is fine. But institutions need to support their IRBs to do this work. Institutions who, you know, sort of retire and let the IRB, HRPP define their role, the investigators don't necessarily, it's not easier for them to do this work. It's tough, and particularly tough until you're used to it and know how to do it. And that takes, you know, sort of significant sort of courage to embark on that. And when we speak to the IRBs, they say, that is not our job. You know, we get these protocols and they're done. They're finished. All we have to do is balance the ethics. And we come back and say, well, wait a second, justice, selection should be should be equitable. But by the time they feel that, you know, if they get the protocol, it's too late. So we have to back it up, and we also have to make it clear from the IRB that if you do present a protocol that is not considerate of these kinds of issues, you're going to compromise generalizability, compromise the science, compromise who we are as an institution, and that's the expectation from the IRB. And if that's true, then investigators will present proposals that are likely or more likely to be reviewed positively. That takes support from the institution. So I think that, you know, you should be encouraged to set expectations, to ask those questions, and then to think about a depth of consideration which at least identifies and tries to address these challenges. And then I think it's perfectly fair to say the IRB should monitor progress. You know, why do we spend so much time at initial review and then continuing review? It's basically check, nothing's different. Close out, check, closing out. So I think that the IRBs do need support, but I also think we need to think through how we can change the posture of IRBs to be one from defending and seeing their role as protecting the individual participant to one where their role is to make sure that individuals have a choice as to whether to participate, that they are included unless there's a specific reason why they cannot be. So we have a whole set of suggestions for the IRB or the Research Ethics Committee in promoting diversity and inclusion. We spent a lot of time with this, and now we're collaborating with Primer and AHARP and others to sort of get a universal approach to this, because if you can find an IRB that doesn't insist on this, believe me, the PIs will find that IRB and make it possible to follow through. And as I said, I think continuing review is really essential. At continuing review, before the trial is finished and before the trial has, sort of accrued too many patients that it's almost impossible to reverse course, that the questions at continuing review or sooner, if it's enrolling quickly, is, are you on track to approximate the target goals of the protocol? We can all say, for almost anything we do, what the specific aims and the goals, et cetera, are going to be. What we can't do is change the outcome after it's done. So getting a corrective action plan in place at 6 months or a year allows people to put investment in to change the course of that recruitment and retention. But if it's never looked at, if it's never addressed, there's never an expectation, it won't happen. And then there should be rigorous closeout so that you identify which trials are successful, which trials fail, and why. And it may be true that, you say, well, listen, we're at Stanford, we have a white population, we recruit white patients, that's who we see in the hospital largely. And my answer to that is, you're doing a multiple myeloma trial, then either figure it out or do a multi-center trial. And doing a multi-center trial is fine. The problem there, we can go into it, is academic, sort of promotional criteria do not respect the fact that we do better science together than alone, but that's a different trip. So from there, let me go back to some of the things that I was talking about. What are if you think about the sort of elements that we were talking about that needed to be changed, that we looked at through the PI's viewpoint, now let's look at the institutional viewpoint. So first of all, participant and community engagement. So, I really think that it's a problem when the institution expects the individual PI to go to the community and find find their right population of 8 Black patients and 2 Hispanic and 1 who defines themselves as elderly and frail, and says, well, now I've diversified it, because you're using the community instrumentally and not, faithfully and in a real and respectful way. So I think this is a plan that should come from the institution, and you should centralize the idea of what your community outreach will be and invest in that in a way that makes sense for you, and I know that you're on that journey at Stanford. I think it's also one of the major focuses, this foci of the CTSA now, and that has been a welcome addition. But one can develop a community advisory board that is more than performative. It's really a bilateral exchange of information. And there should be a sustainable investment in the community. Now, that also counts, as it were, for the nonprofit status of the institution, but if you don't track it, you cannot possibly avail yourself of it. Educational resources for the community and potential participants. The first time they hear about a clinical trial shouldn't be when you're asking them about participating in a clinical trial. And I can tell you in our community, we sort of road tested some of the words that we were using. And in our community, clinical trial is heard as criminal trial. So we do not use that word often. We say clinical study. Just knowing that changed how I think about communicating. And I've been doing this for years, So I think participant navigators are incredibly helpful, and it helps the individual to feel supported in their journey, as well as to find them and then, direct them. One should always have a recruitment plan for any study that can be reviewed before you waste time recruiting poorly. And that should include community participation if you can. And then, of course, the institution can have training programs for workforce development. We've done a couple of other things just to mention. We have encouraged translators in the communities to get certified so that they can serve our institutions. It's been terrific. And then the people who work on our community advisory board are also now the people that we select to be the community representatives on IRBs and other committees, rather than having the retired judge as the community member. And we've also really struggled to get systems in place to pay participant partners, but I do think we should all adopt that posture, and the systems to support the payment. I can tell you that it took us 1.5 years at my institution to figure out how to pay participant partners, not patient, not people in trials, but the people who help us design and support a trial for their time and effort. I'll spare you the details. So study design and plan, there's traditional, hybrid, and decentralized. It's very important to identify the study questions that are of importance to the community. That's typically not the pharma questions. So just to say, pharma has a product and they want to test it. That may or may not be the community request. I think it's important to engage the patient partners and then to, encourage decentralization in trials to the extent possible. And I think you should modify the contracts in place to accommodate those differences. And amongst them, for instance, if you're going to have a DCT, a decentralized trial, with nurses going to the home, or sort of someone going to the home, they contract with pharma. The PI is still responsible for the conduct of that trial and have no necessary visibility into the contract with the pharma. So they are responsible for something that they have no authority over. You can fix that, but only if you think about it. Some institutions have restricted decentralized trials to investigators under their control, in other words, who are employed or appointed, which really defeats the purpose. I think obviously providing hardware, software, and technical support for DCTs, require trial payment of the required data plans. You'll find people dropping out because they can't afford the data plan that's required. And obviously offer telephone and video visits, lab services near the patient's home if you can, and it will not change the data integrity. And then, of course, support remote monitoring. Designing for inclusion, things that we've mentioned, require the recruitment plan and use the electronic health record to help identify potential participants. I think it's important to consider after-hour clinic hours at the great inconvenience for the PIs, but of great convenience for those people who work, childcare and elder care, and pay and arrange for transportation for both the participant and the caregiver, the person who accompanies. Thinking about that payment needs to be, reimbursement, compensation, and incentives. There are various tax implications and issues of medical, of means-tested eligibility programs that need to be addressed. But people can't wait for 45 days, which is the typical payment interval between putting a payment request into your institution and issuing the check. So we think you should think about that as well. Plain language support by the institution. You know, how many of us have plain language writers on staff? Some do. Dana-Farber Cancer Institute, just to speak to the competition, does. Support for translation. And then, as I said, support for the IRB. So let's take a minute about health literacy and communication. You know, we talk about people with poor health literacy or limited English proficiency. The problem is not that they don't speak English or their preferred language is other than English. The problem is that the communicator is not sharing information in a way that's understandable. It is our problem, and the participant's responsibility is to identify and feel the agency to say when they don't understand something. It's not their, they should be comfortable. And I don't mean just the informed consent form. It's before that and it's after that, and it's written materials and verbal communications, and it's plain language, numeracy, visualization, design, culture, and teach back, and in a language understandable to the participant. And just to say, this is an example from Merck, the one on the left, your left, is that right? Was the original injection design and then redesigned to something that was health literate. I don't care what your English proficiency is. I prefer the one on the right. So when you do this, it makes it easier for everyone. And then I really am sensitive to this nudging issue. When you show data like this, in 20% or 1 in 5, which is perfect, of patients, tumors got at least 30% smaller, is very different than also saying in 80% or 4 out of 5, tumors did not get at least 30% smaller. People need balance when they're trying to make these decisions. And I'll say something about translation, which is incredibly complicated, and I'm now starting to talk as fast as I can. Just a couple of years ago, someone was admitted to my service with an ultra-rare condition by, legislating through policy at the Brigham and Women's Hospital. I went through a 37-page informed consent document, which was written in English, and interpreted it, and then talked to them about it. It took 2.5 hours, and then had to drop off a 1-page Spanish short form. Now, that makes me crazy, that we equip our English-speaking patients with information that they can take home, digest, and come back to whenever they need it in the course of their trial, and that is equivalent to a short form. So is it sufficient? When should documents be translated? Do you translate them before, during, or after? Should they be excluded for language reasons alone? And if so, when? And what steps should we take? And just to remind you that LEP, limited English proficiency, intersects with race and ethnicity. 61% of people in the U.S. speak a language other than English at home, and most are immigrants or born to immigrant parents. They're twice as likely to live in a household below the federal poverty line, and we do not have a national language in the United States. So, the Common Rule and FDA both require information that is given to the subject or the representative shall be in a language understandable to the subject or the representative, but you have to balance time, cost, quality, necessity with justice, autonomy, and understanding. You know, you can't translate into 350 languages just in case somebody walks in the door. So what do? And we did look at this. We did a study where we looked at all clinical trials registered in the US, registered on clinicaltrials.gov with one site in the US. 19% excluded people for English if they did not read, write, or speak English or be a native English speaker. And that is true if you looked at the actual protocols, not at the CT-Gov, in 4 different diseases, of which 2 were cancer, it went up to 36%. The same is true in pediatric trials, where they also require the parent to be fluent in English. So, you know, when is it necessary to translate? I would say if you're in a population and a geography and catchment area, then you probably should translate into those language in advance of or shortly after it's approved. And the timing of translation will impact recruitment. If you don't have those materials, the patient-facing materials in the language of the patient, they will not come forward. And that, I think, is an IRB and a sponsor requirement, but there are always going to be people who speak some other language, and there it's perfectly fair to use a short form and let the investigator and the institution provide interpreter services, and then decide what you're going to translate thereafter. Perhaps it's just the key information, but at least it should be you should think about it. And then, thinking about what's good enough. Well, let me just say that, in my opinion, Title VI of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 defines this as a discrimination. And the logic is the following. People do not have a right to participate in a clinical trial. That's been determined even by the courts. But people have a right to access the opportunity to be in a clinical trial. And if the institution provides that and is funded in part or in whole by the federal government, if the institution provides clinical trials to English speakers, then they should be providing them to non-English speakers. And let me tell you the institutional response. Only OCR can sue. Individual patients can't sue, just to say. So, and there was a case about this, so it's very complicated. But, when you say, can you sue the institution for not providing the translation? They say, but we do provide the translation. We have translation services. The difference is, if you come in for and need translation for clinical care, it's covered by the operating budget. If you come in for clinical research, in most institutions, they charge it to the investigator's study budget. Maybe not here, but let me just say that is the usual response. And there's an incentive to not recruit those people. Now, are there reasons not to include other than English? Sure, if you're looking at, sort of a, language development in nursery school, fine. But, if you say it's because we don't have somebody who speaks both languages or we don't have a translator on hand, that is problematic. And you can do things like, translate into the common languages in the catchment area, and you can include the cost of translation in the study budget, in grant budgets, and/or overhead. Of course, no one's going to want to load it into overhead because it's capped, essentially. And, the institution could track the number of LEP patients. Does it have an impact elsewhere? Yes. If you look at this study that came out last week, the access to new clinic appointments in patients with cancer is directly related to whether or not they speak English or not. So it's independent of the state population of LEP residents. It's independent of the type of lung cancer, but it is dependent on hospital teaching status. Academic teaching hospitals were better than non-teaching hospital at recruiting. We also have, tools and resources for people with disability, as I mentioned. These trials should be resourced. They should be paid. Processes for payment should be efficient and with options, if possible, like a CLIN card or a debit card, Visa card. There are tax implications, which I mentioned, and implications for means-tested eligibility programs. I think we should raise the limit for even before we can possibly cajole the IRS to change the tax code, in my dreams, to raise the limit for collecting Social Security numbers or ITINs, because undocumented people do not usually have a Social Security number. And then there is federal legislation to extend the exclusion for clinical trial participation, which we endorse. Confidentiality and communications, we need clear institutional policies for what can and cannot go over the internet. And this is not about HIPAA necessarily, HIPAA information, but rather the research information. And we need institutional provision of secure cloud for the research surveys and institutions, and then resources to explain data collection, use, storage, and future use to participants and their caregivers, and the EHR permission to be repurposed. And finally, end of study, return of aggregate to results to participants and community, and individual results to participants if they desire, in plain language, understandable to the participant. We should be closing the loop. I think it's important that we transition patients to care and not retain them and to their local provider, and then continue the engagement with the community as possible. I'm not today going to talk about the institutional expectations for the development and support of a diverse workforce. I don't think this work can be done unless we are attentive to diversifying the workforce, and that starts at training programs. And finally, in the last few minutes, I do think we need to hold ourselves accountable, be able to measure what we can measure and improve what we can, and without being able to measure that, we will not be able to make changes. We therefore did an equity by design metrics framework, which is dense, but each of them are on one page to think about each of these domains and how you can plan for diversity and then track and measure your outcome and how you're doing. There are 7 key themes and qualitative and quantitative metrics that you can follow, and each metric has a level of detail and a way of thinking about it if it's helpful. And this work then evolved to a collaboration between us, the Milken Institute of Faster Cures, Clinical Trials Transformation Initiative, and National Academies, where we put together a diversity convergence, a national action plan for diversity. The domains are very similar, but each of them has a step function and a series of steps for an engagement. And we're working on the federal regulations now that need to be changed to make a real change in the participation. So what can we do now? Know your own strengths and challenges individually and together. Ask the tough questions of each other and support the institution and vice versa. Advocate and educate before you agitate and aggravate. So I think that everything we do should be forward-looking. It doesn't help to look back. It helps to plan and then support, be clear about what your expectations are, help people to get where you want them to be so that they're not alone. And it's a journey. What you know today will differ from what you know tomorrow, and it's a marathon, not a sprint. So thank you. You know, I think we will be making measurable progress. I think we already have. I think the fact that you invited me here is evidence of the commitment of us all to change how we're doing work in the future. So thank you. Lydia.
Great. So I have a question here from people watching. From Dr. Shahid, what suggestions do you have for investigators for when they're developing protocols for corporate equity design? Where do you start?
So I would say, so we're not going to fix all problems in a clinical trial. I think what you need to do is to start with what is the demographic of the population that has the disease or is at risk of the condition or disease, or for whom the product is intended if it's an interventional trial. And then decide you're going to try to reach that at scale with the investment that you can. And we have a ton of tools depending on the problem. But we have to know what the problem is. So if you're recruiting, you know, pediatric populations with rare diseases, personally, I think you should just recruit everybody that walks into the door, and you should be doing that aggressively. Because what we don't want to do is inhibit a good product from getting on the market when you don't have the options to diversify that trial in a timely way. I don't think that's the same when we do lung cancer or, you know, breast cancer or hypertension, where there are populations, but we're not doing a good job at outreach.
Questions?
I know I talked for a very long time, and I'm sorry.
I have a question.
Yes, Lydia. I hate when she asks questions. Okay.
You have these incredible tools. I watched some of your courses, webinars. I wonder if you can say a few words about the implementation of the entire package. And you've created a center, and you're not shy, and you reach out to people.
I'm a huge introvert, just for you to know.
But as you're a great advocate then,
I am,
professionally. Yeah. So what do you recommend for institutions who sort of want to do as much of this as possible, but not sort of put the burden again maybe on individuals,
right,
but bring the institution
as
you know, and create a collaborative where there's the advances on multiple fronts?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. So we make everything we do freely available, and then really look to the wider community for correction, and you know, making these tools better, and also for suggestions of what you need. And we're happy to do the work with you, et cetera. So you tell us what you need, and we're your scut puppies, number one. Number two, I think that it's helpful if you have a group dedicated to this of both administration and of investigators and potentially study staff who are committed to this work to begin to identify what you want to tackle, when and how, and prioritize that work. You can't do everything at once, but the institution, and you as individuals can't go up against the institution, nor would the institution want that. The institution is by your side in doing this. They want just as much as you There may be practical issues, money being amongst them. But I think that everybody's on one page here, despite TV shows like The Resident.
Well, I think we're almost out of time, but I wonder if there's any burning questions that somebody would ask. And then there will be an opportunity afterwards, so we're going to go to the patio, and Barbara would be happy to answer any questions there. But any last question?
Yeah.
Dan, I knew you'd have one.
Thank you.
I'm your man of one always.
Of Babs, I take it. Yeah, go ahead.
My concern, at least in oncology trials, which is presented at ASCO, the group I work with, a review of randomized clinical trials, and most of them, 70% or so, sponsored by pharma, run by pharma, written by pharma, and statistics are done by pharma.
Yeah,
Where are the resources going to come from
okay.
to do community-based studies, which I agree are very important?
So, yes, that's a great question. So let me say, we spend a lot of our time with pharma. Pharma now has, an FDA requirement, as you know, to provide a diversity action plan at the end of phase 2. They can do it earlier, but the end of phase 2 before phase 3 and for the product. So they're all over this. And interestingly, the FDA has not said whether they're considering and how they're considering global data, something we've been working with them on extensively. So I do think that pharma is with you on this, but the problem, in my opinion, maybe not at Stanford, is there's a huge divide between the contracting office, the PIs, pharma, and what you need to do on the ground. And what really changed for us was being able to engage our contracts and our master contracts to say, we need funds to support the following activities: translation, interpreters, patient navigators, whatever it is. Now, will they fund investment in the community at Stanford versus, the Brigham? Probably not. But if you have an activity which you've set up, which then needs support, that's fair game. And pharma, I think, is probably the easiest. I think biotech is hard because there's less money, less deep pockets. I also think that NIH is hard, not because NIH won't do it, they'll modify. I mean, and if you get pushback from the NIH, just tell me, But the problem with NIH is that these budgets are capped. So if you decide to, and this is where this problem of having, conflicting needs comes in. If you want to pay for X, it's going to come out of the total cost.
I just wonder if the FDA is going to have the authority and the guts to not approve a drug because it didn't have the right inclusion.
So what I want them to do, by the way, is to approve it for white people. Then see what happens. Like if the study is done on white people, approve it for white people. And see what happens. I mean, they don't want to do that. I don't want them to do that. But I sort of feel like if that's the data and they're data-driven, they should be calling it when they see it. But
Alzheimer's drug was just like advisory committee approved with the caveat, well, you didn't have enough minority piece. But they recommended approval.
well, I showed you, because the data is the data, and you're not going to, if you wanted to power a study for true diversity so that you knew that it worked in African American, Black or African American, you excluded Nigeria, South Africa, but African American. If you did one for Native Americans, for, Hispanic, whatever and then layered on male, female, age, does it work as well at 50? Does it work as well for, you would have a huge trial that would never finish. So my argument there is that you need a diverse enough trial with enough patients that you can see if there's a signal. If there's a signal, then you can do an extension study. And we're sitting there with FDA arguing that if you don't have the number of patients, then you should require an extension study. And there should be a provision. So they say, they came out with a commitment, what's it called? Statement, commitment, post-approval commitments and post-approval requirements, right? That's elective. Pharma never has to finish those. So the answer to that is Cures 2.0.
Barbara, thank you so much. That would give us a lot to.
Thank you.